But anyone who has any sense of history knows that Xi Jinping will not stop threatening the safety and security of Taiwan. He is not a normal leader, and he has no interest in normal reactions or relations with the rest of the world. The CCP has spent decades taking drastic measures to protect their communist experiment. When China was finally allowed to start joining international organizations in the 1970s, there were a lot of experts out there who assumed that their participation would somehow transform Beijing into a global team player. They said the same thing about Xi when he took the presidency, and they have been shown to be wrong. I am absolutely delighted to join you, and I thank IDIA so much for the invitation to be here this afternoon and to speak with you for a few moments. We have had some wonderful meetings, among them President Tsai, and the opportunity to talk with her about hopes, dreams, plans, and approaches for Taiwan and how they retain their independence and how we, democracies across the globe, support Taiwan in their efforts. Also with Foreign Minister Wu. Great conversations there among others, and more good visits to come. And this is a really important time to be having these conversations, because over the past decade, what the world has witnessed is authoritarian regimes that are gaining an alarming amount of power in the international community. And unfortunately, far too many people who know better have treated this like an academic problem rather than a threat to freedom and democracy. If you think back to the weeks before Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, you'll recall that the loudest and most influential voices weren't focused on de-escalation. Despite all evidence to the contrary, they insisted that Putin would see reason, not because it made sense for Russia, but because it's what the international community declared was the only acceptable result. Now, 6 months later, we have proof of how foolish this was. More than 5,000 civilians are dead. More than 7,000 are injured. Food and energy supply chains are in a shambles. And still, far too many world leaders are relying on the same failed strategies that got us to this place, specifically because the alternative is too frightening for them to even imagine. And now, the same people who blamed Zelensky for Putin's crimes have lined up to blame anyone but Xi Jinping for the missiles that are flying toward Taiwan. Their approach is dealing with dictators that has failed us, because it assumes that all global leaders, no matter who they are, can be persuaded to behave normally. But anyone who has any sense of history knows that Xi Jinping will not stop threatening the safety and security of Taiwan simply because it would be in everyone's best interest to do so. He is not a normal leader, and he has no interest in normal reactions or relations with the rest of the world. The CCP has spent decades taking drastic measures to protect their communist experiment. When China was finally allowed to start joining international organizations in the 1970s, there were a lot of experts out there who assumed that their participation would somehow transform Beijing into a global team player. They said the same thing about Xi when he took the presidency, and they have been shown to be wrong on each account. Being a team player was never the goal for the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP used their membership in the UN, the IMF, the WHO, and other key bodies to repair their economy and to build their own power. Not only has their Marxist-driven philosophy not changed, we also know that they're using their influence in these organizations as well as programs like the Belt and Road Initiative to bully and isolate nations that they are wanting to control. This is the reality of the situation, and we, like past generations of policymakers and activists, have a choice to make. Will we fight the rise of authoritarianism, or will we capitulate to it? For me, there is no middle ground. But I can tell you from experience that persuading people of this is much more difficult than you would think it would be. Here's an example of how this conversation is playing out in the United States. Even in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, Washington understood that the world was facing more than just a healthcare crisis. We knew Beijing was being less than truthful about the origins of the virus. We knew that they were manipulating the WHO, and we knew the economic consequences of the pandemic were going to be devastating. Clearly, in addition to meeting the needs of our own people, we needed to address our entanglement with the Chinese government and their economy. And for a while, we made progress because everyone understood it was going to take more than strongly worded letters to fix what the CCP had managed to break. I produced bipartisan legislation to repatriate our supply chains and give American companies control over our supply of pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, and other critical products. We had bipartisan discussions about our participation in international organizations. We didn't always agree on the how to go about this, but our goals were the same. But as the weeks wore on and the pandemic died, it became increasingly clear that many of my colleagues were feeling the pressure from Beijing. Talking about the problem was one thing, but actually defying the CCP came with real Beijing would punish the United States. And so they capitulated. 2 years later, we've made almost no meaningful progress unraveling ourselves from the dangerous influences of the CCP. Too often, the most powerful people in the United States and around the world have decided to take the easier path. And in the process, they end up ignoring the root of the problem. By allowing our moral stand against authoritarianism to devolve into a political debate over culture and philosophy, we have opened our countrymen up to the influence of propaganda and made ourselves and our partners vulnerable. This isn't responsible democracy. One of the reasons I've come to Taipei to have these conversations with Taiwan's leaders is because we can't afford to let the Chinese Communist Party write the world's foreign policy. For decades, any nation with enough power to challenge Beijing has begged somebody else to jump in and help do that job. Perhaps the world has wasted time and precious lives fleeing moral clarity in favor of appeasement. This weak-kneed approach is not only divorced from reality, it has put Taiwan and others in extreme danger. It's also the reason why the people of Ukraine are suffering and why leaders in Western Europe are in a panic over energy shortages. The only way we can stop and reverse this rise of authoritarianism around the globe is to do everything we possibly can to make sure that authoritarians fail. Appeasement is not and never has been enough. We have to get in their way. That starts with sharing the benefits of military, diplomatic, and economic power. I want to focus on the military element with the time that I have left, because the key to maintaining a healthy balance of power is maintaining basic defense capabilities. Something we focus on in the Senate Armed Services Committee is modernizing the American military and preparing our troops for the future fight, as opposed to the fight we wish we were facing. I know that Taiwan is in the middle of its own debate over military modernization, and that President Tsai is pushing for a much-needed shift toward an asymmetric strategy. I've also noted the budget increase of 13.9% that will be used for defense. I know that President Tsai has met with some resistance on this point, but China's continued aggression in and around Taiwan's territory is just one example of why a defense-focused force is so critical to maintaining the safety and security of the region. Xi Jinping and his military leaders are not prone to making sour-of-the-moment decisions. They planned for this moment, and they were just waiting for an excuse to bully Taiwan. They are clearly testing Taiwan's resolve and the rest of the world's tolerance for even more imperialist violence. Most of you probably know that in May, President Biden signed the Ukraine Democracy Defense Land Lease Act into law, and that gave him the authority to provide defense aid to Kyiv and other governments in Eastern Europe. At the end of July, I introduced similar bicameral, bipartisan legislation that would allow a U.S. president to expedite similar types of military aid to Taipei. In addition to providing these defense articles, this legislation would strategize U.S. defense policy in support of Taiwan, require comprehensive reporting of what Taiwan needs to defend itself, and give us a clearer picture of what the threat from the PLA actually appears to be. Most of the opposition to passing this bill depends on the assertion that because the U.S. has never given this type of authority to a president outside of a time of conflict, we should not do so now. But I would counter that criticism by pointing out that deterrence itself is the point. Sending a warning is the point. Why would we wait until war breaks out before letting Beijing know that Taiwan will immediately have the resources it needs to defend itself? The fundamental support is key to keeping people safe. It is key to Taiwan, and it is key across the Indo-Pacific. It's also the first step in breaking Beijing's stranglehold on the global economy. So much of China's power rests in the CCP's ability to instill fear. That's their goal. Fearful people are easier to control. Whether it is the fear of violence or the fear of shortages and the fear of economic pressure. But by taking an honest look at strategic vulnerabilities in the Indo-Pacific and around the globe, we can help neutralize threats of violence and make it possible for these nations to act in their own best interests, which will in turn help reduce that economic pressure. It's easy on paper. It is incredibly difficult and painful in practice. But again, any discussion about the impact of these policies must end with us asking ourselves that one simple question. Will we rise to the occasion, or will we give up? Will we fight, or will we capitulate? On that question, as I said earlier, for me, there is no middle ground, but the futile search for one that persists at the UN and in various legislatures around the world has empowered the Chinese Communist Party and brought Taiwan to the brink of a war. Perhaps the diplomats and the policymakers behind those compromises mean well. Perhaps they don't. But here's what I would say to them, no matter what their intentions are. So-called lines in the sand mean nothing if no one is willing to put their lives and their livelihoods on the line to defend them. And so we fight. We fight for freedom and diplomacy and for liberty. And I am here today because I believe this is a fight that we will win. The partnership between the U.S. and Taiwan makes Beijing really a little bit nervous, and that's for a reason. They're not accustomed to defiance. But when they look at the U.S. and Taiwan, they see more than just a transactional partnership. They see a relationship that is growing leaps and bounds beyond the restrictions the CCP would like to impose on either Taiwan or the U.S. And most importantly, they see our collective resolve to work together to make sure that they fail in their quest for global domination. I want to commend each of you that are in the room today, and I commend the leadership in Taiwan for bravery and for an enduring commitment that they are living out for all the world to see, that they stand in the common cause for freedom. Thank you all.
谢。